Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 27th Annual National Security Law Conference here at Duke Law School. We're in the second day of what's been a terrific conference and just some amazing speakers. And that's going to continue this morning, opening up with my longtime friends, Ms. Michele Pearce and Mr. Colonel Professor Brother Adam Oler. Our convention, if you're just joining the conference, is that we ask those of you here and those of you online to take a look at the bios by clicking on the appropriate name on the agenda. However, just a couple things about these two people. They're very special to me. I think we've known each other for let's go with 20 plus years in deference to sensibilities. Michele began her public service in the United States Air Force, and maybe she'll share a little bit of that experience with us. But then she's done a lot of things. She went to Capitol Hill for a while, worked for Susan Collins, Senator Susan Collins, and did all kinds of interesting things. Then she came back to the Pentagon, first in the DoD General Counsel's office, but later in the Army General Counsel office, where she completed that portion of her public service as the Acting General Counsel of the Army. And now she's in big law with Covington, and we're super happy to have her here. Adam and I go back a long time. We were in the Air Force together. Adam had the shall I say, the challenge of being my executive officer during part of his career, but he's done lots of other things. He was a military judge, served in Korea, served in the Middle East twice, two different kinds of jobs, one in operational, one in the Pentagon, in addition to a wide variety of other jobs, including being a staff judge advocate, military judge, and many other things. And his wife, incidentally, was my other executive officer, and she was magnificent and is also a mutual friend of the three of us. Yeah, mutual friend of Adam, too. They're going to give us, probably the most overarching thing of the last 2 years, of course, has been the pandemic. And we're going to hear from them about different perspectives of how the U.S. government has responded to that. And then we're, of course, going to open it up for some questions. Without further ado, let me turn it over to the experts.
General Dunlap, thank you so much. And I'm going to begin as we're required to by the people that let us come down here. So the comments that we're going to make are our own, right? So we're not representing the government or the law firm. And I say that because that gives us some freedom to talk about stuff, especially when it comes to the Q&A portion as well. But above all, General Dunlap and Joy, thank you for inviting us down here again. To say this is the highlight of the year for us is an understatement. It's an honor to be here, and especially exciting to meet the young, and you're all so young, law students. I normally try to begin with a personal story, but for those of you that were here yesterday and heard Mike Newton say that everybody remembers his birthday because that's the day that the appeal and the Eichmann decision came down, there's no reason to even try and top that. So always good to follow Mike on those things as well. What we want to talk about this morning for a little bit is share with you some of the lessons that we have captured based on our experiences and some of the research we've done too about the impact of COVID on the legal profession so far. Now, the title of this presentation, Lessons Encountered, is deliberate. First of all, I stole it from a book by Rich Hooker and Joe Collins, but the difference between lessons learned and lessons encountered, that's a very important distinction. It is a distinction with a difference because there's a lot of stuff here that we've come in touch with, that we're in contact with, that we're still searching to find out what the exact lesson from it is going to be. So let us kick off with this piece, if I can, there we go. This is from the American Bar Association, and it's fairly recent. And I know you can read the slide, but what it comes down to is that so much of our profession had involved personal relationships and person-to-person contact that, with few exceptions, compared to other professions, medicine probably being the main one, this was really quite a shock to us as a profession. And I will tell you that while we focus as Americans mostly on the American aspect of this, across the world, there's a lot of literature emerging on the impact of COVID on the legal profession in other countries, and there's a lot of valuable material if you start looking into that as well. So I think what we're going to do this morning is begin with Ms. Pearce, with Michele, and she really had an integral part in a very applied aspect of COVID, couldn't have more of one, and that involved her role when she was the acting Army GC, and before that, working in the Office of General Counsel, and specifically Operation Warp Speed, because this is, at the operational level, if you will, through my lens, this is where the rubber really met the road in terms of the roles of lawyers in a time during crisis. So with that, ma'am, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, General Dunlap, for the kind invitation. Really appreciate it. Really is truly wonderful to see you and Joy and others here. I think this is my third time here. But in any event, I did want to share some just basic background information about Operation Warp Speed. I'm confident people are very familiar with it. But just to put into context as we proceed through the presentation, why the human interaction and the practice of law, why that topic is something that's so important for us to be thinking about. And I'm going to start with just giving you a bit of information about this operation and how it came together, and just the pillars of how the mission was defined, who the people were that participated in the mission, and then a little bit about the organization. But so I was dual-hatted as the Principal Deputy General Counsel and the Acting General Counsel of the Department of the Army. So what that meant was I was essentially doing two jobs. I was managing the Office of the General Counsel. I was also advising the Secretary of the Army and then working very closely with my counterparts in the Office of General Counsel at DOD to stand up what essentially we thought at the beginning was a task force. What we came to understand was that it was much bigger than that and required, as a result of the pandemic and the crisis that we were facing at the time, a whole of government effort to address vaccine production and vaccine distribution. So the slide before you, I put a red box around the legal team. And interestingly enough, the first question, of course, after we defined what the mission was to figure out who would be the appropriate attorneys staffing the mission. And you can see how complicated this is. We're talking interagency, military, civilian, HHS personnel, DOD personnel. All of the attorneys, these were the three principal attorneys assigned under my leadership in the Army, but the three principal attorneys are attorneys that one came from DOD OGC, one came from the Army Research Lab, and then another person from the interagency. And it's interesting to note that as we are trying to identify what the characteristics and capabilities and the skill sets we were looking for to put this team together, we realized that we needed an acquisitions attorney, of course. We needed an intel attorney, and then we needed a contracts attorney. So those are the skill sets that these three attorneys brought to the team. And remarkably, for a very small team, there were others that we brought on board, but these were the three initial attorneys. And you can see how complicated the wiring diagram is here, reflecting the numbers of people involved in coming to decisions as the task force, and then, of course, the operation got underway. And I would say that one of the most challenging aspects, at least initially, from a legal perspective, was making sure that this team of people who had never worked together before could rapidly get together. And we didn't have the luxury of allowing people to telework, right? Because we were supporting an operation that was critical to addressing this crisis. And so as an attorney who is managing that team, I had to kind of work through, was that the right answer for this team? Could we make telework arrangements? Did that make any sense? Ultimately, we decided that that was not going to work for us. And General Parna was insistent, and I think rightly so, on making sure that the team was co-located, everybody was together, reporting into a headquarters at HHS. So I think that in terms of the legal construct, this small team of people who we rapidly put together really served our nation extraordinarily well, because they were answering incredibly important questions about the Defense Production Act, about contracting with private industry, working across the executive branch and through Congress and other stakeholders in the process to ensure that the mission stayed on track from a legal perspective, and that the respective authorities that were required to get not just the manufacturing capability stood up, but also the distribution piece of this operation underway was truly an incredible task. And this small team of bright, talented attorneys made it happen. And I can't say, enough how much it required in terms of dedication and perseverance and, just managing the bureaucracy. You can see the extent of the bureaucracy here in terms of how this operation was constructed and how it functioned. And these three lawyers, I can't say enough about the fact that they put their own family's safety, their own safety aside, they reported into work, and they made sure that our nation could move forward with respect to Defense Production Act authorities, and of course, eventually, the distribution of over 300 million vaccines. So that's kind of, Adam, just kind of the broad overview of what the organization looked like. And of course, we all know the mission. I identified some of the legal challenges, but fundamentally, in my view, the attorneys that supported this operation really served a critical role, and in my view, should be commended, of course, for all the work that they did. And I don't know if it's talked about very often, but it's remarkable that 3 line attorneys, essentially, from our government's executive branch basically made sure that 300 million vaccines were distributed and that we could meaningfully address the pandemic.
I think one of the lessons here to take from this too is we sometimes have to reconsider how we look at national security law. And what do I mean by that? The paradigm that we typically use for national security law begins with the interaction among states, conflict between states, states in competition with each other. If you go over to Europe right now, or you start looking at a lot of other places, there's a different security lens to look through stuff, not so much through the lens of states interacting with states in a Westphalian perspective, but in a human security perspective. Right now, FDR, a number of years ago, 80 years ago, came up with the 4 freedoms, but the fact of the matter is that, at least until this weekend, the biggest security challenge in the world was a human security issue, not a state-on-state issue. When we start looking at climate change, rising tides, more pandemics, opening of all of these issues that are coming up require specialization in the law that 10 years ago we would not have couched as national security law, but absolutely should be now. And so if we look at this org chart and you see that the specialists here are acquisition law, intelligence, health law, all of those pieces, those are national security lawyers of the first order, but in the lens of human security. Because human security failures can threaten our national interests more and more, every bit as much as the state-on-state and state actor threats that emerge as well. So for instance, one of the things we're always worried about and always look at is what happens, God forbid, there's a famine in North Africa. And you have Egypt, for instance, or it doesn't matter the country, but it's take a country with 102 million people with 1 million more people being born every 18 months in that country, right? If there is a famine, right, a human security issue, you're going to have massive immigration from Africa into Europe, which we know, unfortunately, but in reality, is going to threaten the liberal democracies in those countries because of the social shock that attends to that. But the issue of how do you prevent famine isn't normally looked at as a national security issue on a state level. It is, however, an extremely important human security issue. And COVID, I think, and this is such a phenomenal, maybe the prime example of how national security law has to incorporate human security just as much as the traditional lens that we look through it.
And Adam, I would add that the success of Operation Warp Speed was due in large part to cooperation between all of the stakeholders. So you have a four-star general, which at the time that announcement was made, people were concerned about it. Why is the military leading this effort? And in any event, that was a decision that was made. And General Parna, of course, worked very closely with his counterparts, but ultimately, the Department of Defense was the driving force behind Operation Warp Speed, despite some criticism that we received after having made that decision. And I would say, in terms of just the stakeholders involved who, at the outset, expressed concerns about any number of aspects of what Operation Warp Speed was, from its name to who was in charge and at what levels various authorities needed to be approved and who was ultimately making decisions on behalf of this effort. It was very complicated, but the people involved really worked well together, in my view, and made sure that the right decisions were made at the right time to ensure that the mission could stay on track. But it was a very complicated, multi-numbers of agencies, stakeholders in Congress, others in the medical community. It took all of those people working together, and I think that is a bright spot, considering where we are as a country, to know that we've had this network of people coming together to address a national crisis. And they did such a phenomenal job, of course, despite the circumstances and despite the complicating aspects of bringing together this many people with a $10 billion budget and a pressing crisis that no one was certain at the outset they were going to be able to solve anything, right? We didn't know that the vaccine trials were going to be successful. We didn't know that this effort was going to ultimately result in $300 million vaccines. So that provides a little bit of backdrop as to why the Department of Defense was involved, of course, but I think in the future, we now have a model, thankfully, for future pandemics and future crises. This is a really terrific example of people coming together and making a difficult mission happen.
And I think what we'll do now, if it's okay, we'll go ahead and we're going to try and just offer some of the other challenges and lessons that we have seen emerge in the last couple of years. And there are also some opportunities here as well that have come up. So here's the good news. Some maybe you're more familiar with than others, right? The IT worked. Some law firms have managed to cut overhead. The government has not managed to do that yet. It may. But at the same time, occupancy rates in places like New York are the lowest they've maybe ever been in business space, right? So that's going to have a second order effect. There's some reduction in cost for families. Now, there's a flip side to this that we're going to talk about, but for parents who are able to stay home, that can limit the costs of childcare. It can reduce the costs of commuting. Most of the research says that the most expensive things the family has to do, other than providing a roof over the family's head, is arranging for the transportation to commute in and out of where they work in the cities. And this helps in that regard as well. And the other thing is the warnings of a 2008-like disaster on the legal profession. Some of you that you all very young at that point, but when the economy collapsed, you had this glut of law graduates that couldn't find work, and about a third of them don't even end up going into the profession and take their loans with them into wherever it is that they can find work. That didn't happen here. And in fact, what we saw is, empirically, we know that the amount of work for bankruptcy lawyers, for better or worse, right, positive deconstruction, right, happened in the United States and in the free world, right? There was a lot of bankruptcy law, but new businesses didn't start up as much, and now we've got all sorts of other issues. So the impact on the profession as a whole in terms of its sustainability from an economic model proved to be a whole lot better than it was in 2008. But here are some of the challenges that get written, and I've got a bibliography on the end of this I can share with you. I'll go into some details here because I think it's helpful, right? So this idea of not going back. if you go look at the stuff that's been written on it so far, there is a difference of opinion. There are people who are writing that are saying when this is over, right, this is recently as December, you'll find pieces that say that we're going to end up going back in person, right? We have to. It's the nature of the profession. It's the character of the profession. But it depends on who you ask. So you have a lot of leadership elements that say we're going to come back in person, but if you start looking to people about what they're prioritizing in terms of hiring, the ability to telework is a big part of it now. And it's not just because people don't necessarily want to come to work, it's because of the financial implications of not having to commute and the childcare issues, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen some improvement in hiring inequities. And what do I mean by that? Again, if you have somebody who, because of whatever reason, lives way outside of a city, because that's where they can afford housing, that's because where the schools are better, that's because where crime is lower, et cetera, et cetera. These are people who may not have applied for jobs downtown or in urban areas or even in the state who are now able to work in that environment, right? Because they are able to do it from a distance. So that has opened up. All of you, for those of you that have kids, you know that the educational unevenness, it hasn't just impacted at the K through 12 level and the college level. Watch this space because there's litigation brewing. Originally, there was some thought that maybe there wasn't going to be as much litigation. There's a professor down at Stetson named Peter Lake who has written on this very extensively, and he said originally he didn't think there would be much litigation, that is students going after their universities, and that it wasn't going to be successful. Now it looks like there may be some ability for the students to recapture. This isn't legal advice. Don't go spend the money yet, okay? But there may be an opportunity to recoup some of that, and it's going to shape how the universities move forward. I will say, though, that the other thing here is that we have to be very careful as a profession not to have haves and have-nots in terms of education, so that the people that can afford it, that 10% of the country that owns 80% of the country's wealth, right, doesn't get one level of education because they can afford to go in person, and the rest of the law schools and graduate schools don't let them go in person for financial reasons and whatnot. And we do also know empirically that there's a different level of education between teaching in person and teaching long distance over Zoom. And I'm going to focus on this next one a little bit, this disparity for women and minorities. I think it would be improper to talk about lessons encountered from COVID without sharing some of the data on this that is that deserves some attention. So the ABA has done some work on this, then it gets cited in other places. This data is from late last year. Okay, so this is fairly recent. There were some initial surveys that were done in 2020, early in 2020, but now we're starting to get some stuff now that we're 2 years into this. And I'm just going to, I'll read some of this. 63% of female lawyers and 62% of lawyers of color reported feeling it was hard to keep home work separate, compared with 51% of attorneys overall and 44% of men. 52% of female lawyers and 48% of lawyers of color reported feeling work stress during the pandemic. The counter number to that is 40%. And the ABA report also notes that female lawyers were nearly 3 times, think of that, because about half the people in our profession right now are women. Report also notes that female lawyers were nearly 3 times as likely as men to take on additional child care responsibilities during the pandemic. Now, in addition to that not being fair on its face, it also means that we have to be very careful that if you're a hiring partner at a law firm or a hiring authority in a government agency, that you don't start thinking, or that you don't get the impression, we have to make sure that the person doesn't think, I'm not going to hire that mother of 2 people, because I know that she is 3 times or 5 times more likely, 3 times as likely to be distracted at work as the male person that I'm thinking about hiring. So we talked last night, what are some of the things that we can do to maybe protect against this or to address this? One of them is, if you're a law firm and you value diversity in your law firm, and hopefully you will for all sorts of reasons, you probably want to start thinking about offering childcare on site. Indeed, we know that that is a huge recruiting tool. It's a big recruiting tool in the military. Offering health insurance at a reasonable rate, not just for the member, but for their family as well, is extraordinary. General Dunlap has cited the quote often that the The most educated enlisted career field in the military, anybody want to take a guess what it is? It's the musicians. It's the band. Why? Why do they come in the military? It's not the uniforms. It's because they get health insurance. Because most of the art industry doesn't provide health insurance. And if you're a family of 5, it's not unusual to spend $10,000 or $12,000 on that health insurance. So these are all things that can be done to address it as well. And DEI and other things like that within a law firm, within the government, to address these issues and have these conversations to build trust can help as well. So this is an important issue that we're going to be confronting as well. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that piece? I'm sorry.
I would say, and I feel comfortable saying this as a person who works at Covington, our firm is very dedicated to D&I efforts. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do, it's because corporations in America are now looking at law firms' statistics on D&I, looking at the number of women who make partner, looking at any number of other factors to assess whether or not they want to work with you. And so in my view, it's such an incredibly important issue for firms to really wrap their arms around, because I think there's going to come a point in time when as soon as you start to enter into negotiations with a potential client, they're going to want you to turn over all kinds of data about your workforce and all kinds of data about the programs that you have to address these types of issues. And that's happening now. It's just going to get, I think, much more attention, particularly during, as we proceed from COVID and all of the different restrictions that people have had. A lot of people in my firm, for example, want work-life balance. That's going to change the nature of the practice of law, because people don't want to work 90 hours a week, and they want to be able to take care of their families. And I think that the statistic about the number of women who are juggling both responsibilities at home and at work, big law firms, any law firm is going to have to come to terms with how is the best way to manage that in a way that's fair to everybody in your workforce. But it's something that we think about and talk about on a regular basis. And for me, as an attorney who's managing a team of young attorneys and working with young attorneys, my kids are older. This isn't a concern that I have, but I am concerned about the attorneys who have young kids at home and how they're managing daycare with all of the different restrictions related to vaccinations for kids and daycare responsibilities. And it's a real challenge and it's a problem. And I think as more firms bring their workforces back into the office, we're going to have to be very sensitive to everybody's concerns and manage that and track it very closely.
So let's talk about an opportunity here too that I think would be, and we were talking about this last night, that this is something that we might want to seize on. These are statistics from the World Justice Project. And this is before COVID-19, but look at these numbers, please. Research published by WJP in 2019 found that 66% of Americans had experienced a civil legal problem in the past 2 years, substantially more than 49% of people in 100 other countries. All right, so that first paragraph says we have a problem, right? There are more issues here. But only 33% of Americans were able to access the help they needed to resolve their problem. We rank 109th out of 128 countries worldwide in terms of accessibility to affordability of civil legal services. So we need, another lesson encountered is this is an opportunity for us using, right, the IT that has worked so well to make it possible for people who previously didn't have access to legal relief and legal help to have it. We know that in the civil law, right, generally if the two parties, Washington versus Crawford doesn't apply in civil cases, right? The confrontation clause, et cetera, doesn't apply. So in civil cases, provided the parties agree, right, the hearing, the mediation, et cetera, can be done remotely. Now, there are challenges there we can talk about in Q&A if you want to that we've come up with as well. But we haven't yet seen that effort to harness internet access as a way to provide more legal services to more people. And, we're the richest country in the world, still, 5–10% of the global economy, but rank 109th out of access to law. That's a pretty severe statistic. It's also a measurable statistic and one that we ought to be able to address. Question is, who's going to take the leadership role in this, right? Is it going to be the firms? There's not a lot of money necessarily in this. Should it be the government that expands legal aid? Well, initially, yeah, but at the federal level, probably not. At the state level, that would be a good thing, right? And we know in terms of the ability to have social mobility in a society, the access to legal efforts to either to get a contract done or to address or to just review a property contract, a house sale as opposed to a lease agreement, helps social mobility in a society too. So just an area where we might be able to improve as well, and is worth, frankly, is something that would be good to write on going further. So. I always wonder every time I talk about how great the IT was and it worked during COVID, and Adam can't move a slide. All right, so let me talk about this from my perspective. I'm still in the government. I'm in DOD. For those of you looking at government careers that are in them, here's some of the challenges. One, of course, is how much remote work in general. The Air Force has, again, not speaking for the Air Force, but the Air Force has a reg that, or instruction now that encourages more and more telework for the civilian workforce. Having been an SJA at a large legal office, I can tell you it would have been very, very difficult to have the civilian attorneys at home and the military lawyers in place. But the nature of military service really is you begin the morning in formation, right? So when you show up at your legal office in the morning, we just, we'll get to work. That is under the military regs, that's a formation. That's the same thing as guard mount, right? But then if you're the Air Force and you're trying to recruit people and retain people, you have somebody, if somebody's an 05, right, a lieutenant colonel, but they can go get a job as a GS-14 and a GS-15, the lure of that job is going to be much greater if they're able to telework for all the reasons we said at the beginning of this presentation. So how do we compete with that? But I would submit nothing bold. It's not a bold statement to say we probably don't want a teleworking military, right, as a general provision.
And Adam, I would say, in my view, the differences between civilian service and military service really came to light in the Pentagon with respect to who was teleworking and who wasn't. The military members were reporting into the Pentagon. A lot of civilians were not. And that was a policy that was enacted and implemented at the highest levels of the department because we didn't want everybody reporting into the Pentagon and getting sick and then, inevitably confronting a much more dire situation. But I think for national security lawyers, I don't think teleworking is the right answer. I think you have to show up. If you work in the Pentagon to the extent that you can safely, you need to be there. I mean, it's not just a question of accessing secret and classified information. It's also an issue of making sure that the civilian and military teams that are jointly working on problem sets are in the same space, talking and working together to solve, problems. And I am sensitive to individual needs. And, one of the very difficult decisions that I had to make preliminarily in my office managing, all of the 1,500 attorneys who reported up through to my office was, were we going to have a uniform policy on teleworking? And if we were going to do that, who could stay home legitimately and that there were legitimate needs that would require them to stay home, and could we make accommodations for them? And then who were going to be forced to basically show up? We ultimately decided as a team that we were going to have our senior attorneys report in. And so all of the deputies who reported to me, so acquisition, the deputy for acquisition, contracts, intel, and other areas, reported in and came to the Pentagon every day, but at great cost to them and their families. And they expressed, concern about reporting in at that time. We had no vaccines, of course, but I felt we didn't have a choice. We really needed to have that team there so that when the secretary called and said, I'm trying to sort out a legal issue, the right attorney with the right skill set could provide the secretary with that advice.
And part of it is that when all the schools closed, Fairfax County, Arlington County, when they were closed, and you had teenagers at home or however old they were, you had to then go into work, that created a heck of a tension. And some heck of a tension, not a heck of a tension. And so we had to wrestle with that over at the DoD office that I'm in. And it's a challenge, but think about this too, through the national security lens here at Lens, right? So if you look at this, if you are going to be a national security lawyer and you want to go into the IC, the intelligence community, or you want to do that kind of work in the Pentagon or anywhere around the country or some law enforcement agencies, you're never going to be able to telework. Never's a long time. That's an assumption. But the going in assumption is that you're not going to be able to telework because you're going to be working in a secured facility, a SCIF. Now, if you're a senior leader of one of those organizations and you are trying to recruit people, the best people into your organization, and you have a candidate, and you tell the candidate, look, would love to have you here, by the way, you're never going to telework, how are you going to get those people in, right? Are they going to, many of them will want to come in, but they may have family obligations. It means that there's a significant additional cost because they're going to have to pay for childcare, an au pair, transportation, all of these things. But we're not at the point where, so there's the competition piece competing for talent as well that's going to be a challenge. Now, how might this be accommodated? We've talked about it. One thing we said before about offering childcare. Part of it may be a different pay structure, that people who don't telework get paid a little bit more, right, in order to balance it. OPM can do that if they want to. These are things that we're going to need to think about. Then there's the protection of information piece. Of course, that's tied into the other one. But, you know, I talk to the students at where I teach now at the War College. While the law involving privacy hasn't changed a lot, the norms have changed radically. None of my students expect that their social security number or a lot of their health records or their bank records are going to be private, right? A lot of them, if those of us that have done background, SF-86 right, our back, all that information is already in the hands of the PLA. So those norms are changing, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can relax our protection of that information. And if anything, it's going to drive more stuff into that security environment where it has to be done inside of a SCIF. And so it circles as well. And then it comes up a lot, but the threat of grid failure and other pieces as well. We have fortunately not had that issue in the last 2 years. But if our system is vulnerable, right, to cyber attack or to infrastructure failure or something along those lines, and we have gone as a profession into a full remote environment or 80%, 70% remote environment, how is the work going to get done? And if it doesn't get done, since we are the grease in the wheels of the economy, how is the economy going to keep going? So these are all things to think about as well. Again, issues that we've encountered along the way. And so what does all of this mean? And I'll ask you, Michele, from your perspective as one of the top senior leaders in the Pentagon and now in a law firm, your thoughts.
So I think that it's so critically important for particularly lawyers who are leaders working with associates and working with colleagues in the law firm that you undertake, an effort to bring people together at the right time and considering everybody's individual circumstances, of course. But I do think that it's also equally important to building a team and to building, capacity and giving people experience. You have to have people in the office. So one of the things we are reintegrating next month, and we have plans in place to bring people together and programs to ensure that people are working collaboratively together. But, the real test is going to come when we actually integrate and we start to understand people's individual circumstances and concerns. And, I think lawyers who are leaders in the firm are going to have to pay particular attention to, all of the integration aspects of bringing people back. I mean, we've had people out of our office for 2 years. And just getting back into the regular practice of law, not practicing law from your couch in sweatpants is going to be a bit of a challenge, I think. I mean, for all of us, right? And so, but in my view, it's so critically important for particularly the development of a young associate to have access to senior lawyers, to be able to stop by a senior lawyer's office and say, I'm trying to figure this out. And, I've noticed that a lot of associates that I work with are kind of hesitant to call me. So I've tried to make sure that I am accessible and available. But I think that, in my view, has been the aspect of the practice of law that has suffered the most, is, that opportunity for a young attorney to stop by, get advice, for a senior attorney to take a young attorney out to lunch or to meet for breakfast or to grab coffee at the firm. And so that's the one part of this that I am really looking forward to in terms of the reintegration. But I recognize that we all have to be sensitive that, the family issues are going to be a big deal. The emotional just issues of, instead of working from home, working back in an office for potentially long hours, 10 to 12 hours a day. That's a huge shift, I think, in terms of what you have to mentally be prepared for. But I think, working together as a team, a cohesive team, and trying to address those issues is something that we are focused on. And I would expect that all of the firms that are reintegrating are going to pay particular attention to that, because this isn't going to change. And telework policies had never existed at my firm until very recently. And interestingly enough, the telework change came into effect because we had a number of associates basically, highlight for the firm that it was critically important to them moving forward, regardless of what was going on with COVID, that they could have a little bit more work-life balance. And I think that that's just a trend that we're going to see continue. But the question is, how do you manage part of your legal team being at home and working remotely and part of your legal team being in the office? I think it's really challenging. It's one thing if you have a legal team that's been working together for decades and everybody knows each other, it's much easier. And if everybody's operating from the same kind of seniority level. But bringing summer associates in, bringing new associates in, it's something that we're constantly doing, of course, but that kind of turnover doesn't lend itself to building a cohesive team. And I worry about that. And I think that, for people who are young associates, I would advise you that as you start your career, take the time to go and speak with the senior attorneys, build up a relationship and a rapport with those in the firm and rely on them, because that can make the difference between your success in a law firm and your lack of success. So balancing all those interests, your personal interests, of course, and your professional interests, I would say be very thoughtful about how you want to approach that as you decide, I'm going to telework, I'm going to ask to telework, or how you're going to manage that. It's obviously a very personal decision that you have to make in terms of what kinds of accommodations you're going to request. But in my own view, be very thoughtful about it, because ultimately you really want to have the benefit of working with others at the firm and understanding, who you can rely on with respect to professional development and building up your own practice, so to speak.
So, sir, thank you. Maybe hand it over for some questions?
Yeah, just a fascinating panel. And these two people all are the experts. They're such close friends. And once again, they've exceeded my very high expectations. We don't have too much time for questions, but if anybody has a question here, they can come down and use the microphone. But I have two questions. And I think what I'll do is I'll throw them both out. And Adam, maybe you can think about this one while I ask Michele a question. I was super surprised to see the statistics that the U.S. in terms of access to courts was 1/6 of 128. Anecdotally, most of the countries that I've been to, they have almost no pro bono. I don't know how they are exceeding the U.S., and I'm thinking maybe they're using religious leaders and other non-traditional persons to resolve what we might think is legal. Put that in your mind. Michele, really very valuable insight that you gave us, and I hope that somebody is capturing the lessons learned from how Army General Counsel, organized itself and acted. I'm tempted to ask you a lot of questions like how much help were you getting from lawyers elsewhere in the U.S.
Let's just say there were a variety of stakeholders with a variety of opinions.
Yeah, and one of the things you find out in government is there are a lot of lawyers who have a lot of opinions, and some are more informed than others, and some are really just political things as opposed to really legal analysis. But what I want to ask you is that is there going to be a place for the young person who does want to work the 90 hours a week, who does want to put in, especially as they begin their careers, they really want to get their head into it and really become expertise? Or are they not going to be rewarded for that? They're going to be placed, other people who, aren't there for good reasons, work-life balance. And in terms of work-life balance, is that strictly going to be about family? Like, suppose if somebody chooses not to have a family or can't have a family, but their work-life balance might be they like music or they like art or something like that.
So I think, and I hate to be so blunt about this, but the expectation is that you're working 90 hours a week, right? Or you're delivering and you're responding to emails at all hours of the night. We have international clients who are constantly, demanding your time and attention. So I think whether you're in the office or you're at home, you're going to be working those hours if you want to succeed. But I do think that the firm, and we haven't yet come to terms with the telework arrangement because we've never had that arrangement at the firm. We'll see how it plays itself out, but my advice to young associates is, regardless of whether you're physically at the office or at home, do anything and everything to be helpful to the people on your team. Work hard, and of course, know the law and do good work, and I think the rest will take care of itself. But I do think that people are legitimately concerned about the people who are in the office, who get the FaceTime, if you want to call it that, but get to interact with the leadership in the firm on a regular basis. That does provide advantages. And so it is unfair if somebody has a family situation that they have to address, of course, that they're not going to have that kind of interaction. And I think the firm will be tracking that issue closely. But I also think that there is something to be said for developing relationships, and it's really hard to develop relationships when you're at home.
Really appreciate that kind of candor. Adam.
So as I understand the question, why is the disparity?
How are they? I'm really surprised to hear that the U.S. didn't expect to be number one, but 109 of 128 countries, because a lot of the countries I have, like Japan, hardly has any lawyers to start out with. How are all these countries providing access to legal services in a way that obviously the study seems to suggest the U.S. is not?
So the handful of countries that I've worked with, they do tend to be less litigious. So the demand is not there necessarily, but we saw the original statistic though, right, is that you've got 66, there's about a 20-point difference between us and the global average, so that doesn't answer all of it. My understanding is that in the civil system, right, in a lot of the civil code countries, if you go to France or whatnot, if it's a small issue, you have online resources are easier. It's easier to go find a lawyer who can do stuff pretty expeditiously. And some of it's government funded, publicly funded pieces. How World Justice Project came up with that, when they're looking at it, supposedly that number is not criminal law either. We, of course, have a much higher number of people that need help with criminal misconduct. But I think that's an area for more examination, more study. The hopeful thing, though, is now that we have all these online avenues available to us, that there will be an effort as a country to try and emphasize the ability to provide that. So.
Well, you both raised issues which I call, my students are aware, I call these 3-beer conversations, because we could have gone on easily another hour exploring and unpacking these. But I want to say thank you very much. Wow, I really learned a lot, and my good friends, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, can I borrow you for just 2 seconds? So, and Lori Blank, who I think speaking next or afterwards, Joy, we have flowers for you. They're over here. We will put them on it, but once again, everybody knows this doesn't happen without the work that Joy does and the team that they do here to put this together. So I wanted to express our appreciation.
Well, thank you, and we don't want to forget Amanda and Bobby.
Absolutely,
and-
just
and
terrific.
Nicole and the whole rest of the team and Shane and everyone who's helped put together this conference.
Thank you, sir.
And we're looking forward to General Spencer, hopefully in 9 minutes, so. See you
Here's the
then.
next of the general.
That'll be online.